morning, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The Education Ministry today announced the reopening of public schools for exam year students from the 24th of June. So this means that students sitting for SPM, STPM, SVM, that's Sijil Vocational Malaysia, and Sijil Tinggi Agama Malaysia, will be able to resume classes 2 weeks from today. Now, I'm sure this news will probably come as a relief to some parents and maybe even some students, but I can completely understand that the question of when and how to reopen schools is probably one of the toughest and most sensitive decisions the government will have to make. However, having said that, the consideration of when it will be safe to reopen schools has probably weighed against the risk of increasing infections. So I do wonder why it's been that almost every other economic and social and religious activity has been allowed to resume. Even very young children are allowed back in Taskas. Why there's been a delay in reopening schools?
Well, Melissa, I mean, I think it's really a question of perspective and understanding of the enormity of the problem. We have 10,000 schools across the country, and when you think about the intensity of interactions of school students in those classrooms, if you take aside, put aside maybe rural schools where classroom densities are much lower and so on and so forth, you really have a tough question tough challenges in terms of social distancing. You think about 40 kids a class, and some of the pictures that politicians and public health officials have been posing for of social distancing in classes makes it look like you could maybe put 10 students in a class. I'm not quite sure how practical these measures are going to be, especially in terms of how children and the young adults in schools are going to have to discipline themselves in terms of interaction.
You've got the older kids kind of going back to school first. They're probably because of exams. They've lost some time, so hoping to catch up and perhaps not disrupt the academic calendar too much. I'm wondering what this will mean for the younger kids, the younger students. I mean, they have missed a lot of school. Granted, there's been efforts to learn from home, but I'm not sure just how effective that's been. That's still up for debate. So when the time comes for schools to reopen, I'm just wondering how schools will ensure that these students return and perhaps have help in terms of catching up for those who have fallen behind when it comes to the school curriculum.
Yeah, well, it's not an easy situation. I don't think public officials probably are racking their brains over how to do this.
It's a tough one, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's so many moving parts. I mean, if you don't let kids go back to school, how do working parents manage their own, work and life balance issues and, home and domestic responsibilities? I mean, there are all kinds of things that go into the mix. But so I'm rather sympathetic, when it comes to thinking about why it's only delayed now that, and I don't know if the word delay is actually the right word to use, but I think the thing is, this is seen as the right time to move when transmissions seem at their lowest, perhaps, especially in maybe states where they're green zones. Red zones even more difficult.
What we'll do is we'll perhaps try and get the experts to weigh in, the policymakers, the school leaders, and hear what they have to say about this move to reopen schools. All right, but let's move on to other news. Lim Kok Wing University has sparked online outrage after a billboard depicting its founder as, quote, the King of Africa. Now, the billboard was placed at the Lim Kok Wing Cyberjaya campus and depicted a picture of Lim Kok Wing posing with a cheetah and another picture of him completely surrounded by students of African heritage. Now, it's created quite a buzz on social media, and there was even a petition for the removal of the billboard. Lim Kok Wing University has since responded to the many posts on Twitter saying that they have since removed the billboard and regret any misunderstandings.
Yeah, the question, Melissa, is what was the misunderstanding? Who misunderstood what in this story?
Yeah, what was the misunderstanding? I'm quite curious to know.
I think it seems like the people who designed this poster misunderstood either the public mood or were tone deaf about what is happening globally, which of course is the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't think the poster is anything new, Sharaad, but it doesn't make it any less
problematic. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, but you know, the question, of course, at this point in time, you know, it sticks in the throat of many, especially younger people, who've become much more, I think, attuned to issues of racism, especially as it pertains to people of African heritage, not just in the American context, but around the world,
yes,
and also locally.
Locally
we know
too.
we've had on this show, Melissa, discussions of casual racism and then systematic racism
and
against Africans.
And Malaysia's complicity in, you know, the kind of anti-black racism. I also want to point out, Sharaad, that, you know, even though now it's come to light, I'm just wondering how this billboard came to be. When there was discussion of putting this billboard together, did no one in the room said, there is a problem here, this is not okay?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many levels, and I think we'll need a whole show to discuss, I mean, the semiotics of this billboard, not just because the founder of the university, Tan Sri Lim Kok Wing, places himself at the center of an entire continent, claiming rather grandiosely that he is the king of this continent, of its people. Now, I mean, what exactly went through his mind when he thought this was an appropriate way to position himself or locate himself vis-a-vis the many students who come to his university from the African continent, a country of, a continent of many, many countries.
That's right.
So that's one level. And then the other parts of it, what's fascinating, Melissa, at this point in time also is that it sparked off again a discussion of the difference between, the discrepancies between what an institution like Lim Kok Wing wants to present itself to the world and the realities on the ground. So you have on Twitter and social media a lot of stories about the realities that African students or students of African descent experience while they were at that university. And because, you know, these things can't be verified immediately, but, you know, I think that's another story to be told.
So the revelations coming out as a consequence of the online outrage. All right, in just a few minutes, we're going to turn our attention to the Tourism Ministry's newly launched Domestic Tourism Recovery Program. Will domestic tourism be enough to fill the gap left behind by international tourists? We'll find out after this. Stay tuned to consider this.
For joining us. Yes. Hi, Mr. Lim, can you hear us? I'm Sharaad.
Yes, I can. Yeah, Sharaad, how are you?
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. And
I'm Melisa. Hi, how are you?
Hi, Melisa. I'm fine. How are you too?
I'm good, good. Thank you so much for doing this. We're going to have a chat in about a few seconds. Yeah, we're going to go on air live soon.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Kuttan. Now that interstate travel has been allowed once again under the RMCO, the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture today launched a campaign called the Domestic Tourism Recovery Program. Now, the idea is to revive the country's tourism industry by focusing on domestic tourists. However, the question is whether this will be enough of a lifeline. Joining us on the show now to discuss this further, we have C.S. Lim, Vice President of the Malaysian Association of Hotels. Lim, good evening. Thanks so much for joining us on the show tonight. Now, the Visit Malaysia Year 2020 campaign has been cancelled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Instead, there will now be more emphasis on domestic tourism or Cuti-Cuti Malaysia. Now, in your opinion, do you think this is going to be enough to fill the gap?
Okay, good evening, Melisa and Sharaad. Okay, before we even come to very enough, I think the best is we go on based on certain statistics or so-called latest statistics we have. Based on the recent survey by Mark, actually as recent as end of last month, we from our members hotel, domestic actually so-called domestic kind of business make up to about 55% of the overall business. Basically, 55% domestic and 45% international. Okay, that's talking about the numbers. But however, you're talking about spending. Based on the latest report from Tourism Malaysia, that's 2019, the foreign tourists actually spend four times more than one domestic kind of spending. Basically, like to give you the exact figure, 3,003 per person against 800 for domestic spending. So in a way, if you look at based on these statistics, yes, the domestic it's a large significant number, but it's definitely not enough to so-called cover up what the shortfall for this year.
Mr. Lim, to what extent have your members been investing in 2020 in the Visit Malaysia year? Have they, and what kind of returns were they expecting? Is this kind of shortfall likely to push many of your members into bankruptcy or into financial trouble that they might not be able to recover from?
Okay. In a way, I think if you look at the mathematics, with such shortfall, the financial impact is definitely significant. Whether one member will go into so-called temporary closure or permanent closure, that is something which, like I said, we don't have the current data. So in a way, it definitely impacts. Like I said, to what extent, I actually couldn't give you the figure this moment, because a lot of times, let's say this is only the beginning, so-called the impact. Like I say, we still have many more months to go for this year.
Well, I'm wondering, because you said that domestic foreign tourists spend about 4 times more than domestic tourists, and if you kind of couple that, Lim, with the impending recession, the expected recession, plus the job losses and the pay cuts that many Malaysians have had to take or are facing, do you foresee that holidays, even Cuti Malaysia, is now going to be considered a luxury for many households?
Okay. There's Cuti Malaysia. I think we have to look at like say actually there are two aspects. If I were to actually give an opinion, first you're talking about whether if people still have money or afford to go travel, right? That's one. And second is whether how's the attitude towards travel. If you look at, let's say, the current, in terms of wealth kind of situation, like if you compare the so-called wealth of a family or of an individual in Malaysia now compared to maybe 10 years, 20 years ago, there's a different one. And I think in terms of attitude, certain, let's talk about the current generation or the current kind of lifestyle thinking is also very different from, let's say, you're talking about 10 or 20 years ago. So generally, I'm quite sure, they're bound, not, of course, it's going to impact, and you can see that of the economic situation, economic impact, they're bound to be generally impact. But bear in mind that there are people who still have certain kind of savings, certain wealth, who could still like to go holidays. And also remember, COVID-19 does not impact everyone. There are some businesses, some industries are making actually much more money than before COVID-19.
Right, okay. And now I'm just wondering if you could share some specific examples of how, say, a hotel stay will change. I'm thinking about buffet breakfasts or hotels, or the pools in the hotels. How will all that change when you stay at a hotel?
Okay, at this point of time, if you, based on the MOS guideline, like say, currently buffet actually are not allowed to be served. Yeah, at that time, at this currently. So in a way, if you go for stay in a hotel, of course we could not actually serve you buffet anymore. It's a lot of times to be more like set meal, set breakfast that you're going to be served. So in a way, the issue of buffet, maybe later part of the so-called let's say in the event that this disease died down or a vaccine has been found, that could be different. So in that case, even though there are certain procedures that we are trying to actually so-called advise the member, for example, like not every customer can go and take the items from the buffet anymore. It will be served by a chef that's behind the counter, for example, to avoid so-called to minimize contamination. Those are things that may change and will change if, let's say, buffet is allowed to so-called restart in hotels. Yeah.
Mr. Lim, you know, many hotels depend on an ecosystem of activities, of other services provided perhaps outside the hotel, on, you know, block bookings by conferences and such. What about all those other elements that the hotel industry actually depend on?
Oh, okay. Like, if you look at the current situation, of course, you know that it's going to be tough. For example, like what you rightly mentioned, or like conferences. If it conferences with certain, like say, even the current SOP actually issue, is basically talking about social distancing, even with how seats can, how many seats that you can have in a particular room. In a way, to cut the long story short, there will be reduced capacity and additional kind of cost to ensure cleanliness and so on. Of course, that would definitely impact hotel in the short term.
All right. Well, then, in your opinion, what would be the best measure to promote domestic tourism as things stand currently?
Okay, I think the best message, what I think, like, look at the way that I think our Ministry of Health has done really very well in controlling the disease. I mean, you can see the statistic, we basically more or less flatten the curve. So in a way, it will sell Malaysia as a really safe place. One, that's number one. That people can travel in Malaysia safely. I'm talking about against COVID-19. Yeah, I mean especially. And second, hotels. Actually, our Melisa, we actually have going to issue them certain guidelines, certain kind of procedures that comply with MOH to ensure that the safety aspect and health aspect against COVID-19 are in place. Yeah.
Okay. So the best way is to kind of regain people's confidence that it is safe to travel. Okay.
Yeah,
All right, well, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight, Lim. Now we're going to take a quick break, but more on domestic tourism in just a few minutes. Stay tuned to consider this. Thank you for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about domestic tourism. Will it be the lifeline that the industry needs? A survey conducted at the end of last month by the Malaysian Association of Hotels found that hotels in Langkawi and Sabah are expected to be the last to recover from the impact of COVID-19, as these are two states that are highly dependent on international tourists. Joining us on the line now to discuss how Langkawi's tourist industry can bounce back, we have Hezri, Adnan, CEO of the Langkawi Development Authority, which is a government agency responsible for stimulating key sectors of Langkawi. Hezri, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's been reported that only about 35% of hotel guests in Langkawi are local. Hezri, how then can Langkawi bank on domestic tourism? Is this going to be a stopgap measure at best?
Thank you, Melisa. Thank you, Kuttan, for inviting the Langkawi Development Authority on your program. Well, I think we have to make do. As you know, the last year was a very good year for Langkawi. For instance, we managed to attract 3.92 million visitors to Langkawi, and it was a new record for the island last year. And even in January, we were still riding high with some of the five-star hotels registering over 90% occupancy rate. And And all the while, our domestic and international sort of a breakdown was almost 50-50, you know. And with the border control, for now and for I suppose for the next 3 to 6 months, we have to depend on solely the domestic market. Yes.
Okay. Hezri, what have you found from the local players in Langkawi? Have any of them been so damaged as to close shop? And are you looking at the possibility of business failures in Langkawi, whether it's in hotel or related industries?
Well, I think, of course, there's a dent in the tourism industry. You know, by definition, tourism is about the movement of people from one place to another. And if you have movement control, then tourism will stop as a result of the control. So, of course, some businesses will be affected badly with the 3 months because some of them have depleted their savings, and it will take time before they recuperate, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, just before this, we spoke to C.S. Lim from the Malaysian Association of Hotels, and he pointed to the fact that foreign tourists spend 4 times more than the local tourists. I'm wondering whether, banking on local tourism will then be enough to stimulate this, the ecosystem, the economy of tourism in Langkawi. Is it going to be enough if they're spending 4 times less than the average foreign tourist?
Well, if we look at the, for instance, 2018, our tourism receipt was 1.7 billion ringgit. And for each of the, from our estimate, from each of the domestic tourists, they would bring in, or they would spend around 412 ringgit per diem, per day. And a foreign tourist would be spending around 700 ringgit per day, per diem, yeah? So, of course, with half of the, half of the 3.92 million people not coming or not being on the island, of course, there will be a dent. But you see, the other market that is yet to be tapped, and we are really looking seriously into tapping it, is the outbound market in KL and the big cities in Malaysia. And since people cannot, people who with deep pockets cannot travel to, London or New York or all the usual spots. So what choice do they have?
Okay.
And you have places like Langkawi and Kota Kinabalu and all that.
What then is the attraction, Hezri, if, say recreational parks and anything that requires large gatherings of people, all those areas are closed? Where would domestic tourists go then?
Okay, we are planning for Langkawi Great Sale. This will happen for, till end of the year. And we are aiming to have good weekend, interesting weekend packages to attract the domestic tourists. So shopping is one of the areas that we are targeting. And of course, Langkawi, the population of Langkawi is only 110,000. So if people are concerned about social distancing, our density is very low on the island. And there's a lot of, activities to do in Langkawi, like jet skiing. Most of the people who come to Langkawi, they have not been much to the sea. They just go to the attraction, and that's about it. If they go on a 2 nights or 3 night stay, so there are other things to do. And nature tourism, for instance, has a lot to offer, which I think the domestic market has not been very exposed to it as yet, I think.
Hezri, to what extent does your authority, the Langkawi Development Authority, look to either the state government or the federal government, by state government I mean Kuttan government, or the federal government for pointers as to how it should approach this particular crisis?
I have a bit of trouble hearing your question just now, but can you say it again?
Yes. So, to what extent do you at the Langkawi Development Authority look to the Kedah state government or the federal government for guidelines, or are you essentially on your own in Langkawi charting your own course?
Right. I see. So, okay, there's they're not in the same boat anymore. But I think the industrial players in Langkawi are pretty much together on this, you see. So we are speaking on the same language, and there's a lot of interesting packages that are being offered. So, of course, we need government support. It would be very useful if the federal government can pump in some, a dedicated amount of money to spur tourism again. But I think what is most important is for everyone in Langkawi to work together. And I think we are on the same page for most of the associations in Langkawi, including LADA and other authorities as well.
Well, Hezri, I want to ask you about travel to Langkawi, the transportation too. So you either kind of take a ferry across or you fly in. And the days of rock bottom airfares are probably over, given that airlines themselves have to, take fewer passengers and practice social distancing. So that means will higher airfares result in a drop of the number of people who travel to Langkawi?
There's the million-dollar question. Being an island, connectivity is an issue, and we are talking to the ferry operators in Langkawi, the consortium of ferry operators. Of course, with social distancing, they are facing a bit of difficulties in, making enough for the trips or increasing the number of trips. So this will be a challenge, but I think with the packages that we're offering, we will be in a better position to sort of anticipate what kind of numbers. And this will encourage the ferry operators, for instance, to increase their number of ferry trips. What is perhaps more challenging is the airlines, So perhaps one option is to consider charter flights, going to Langkawi. And we are planning some, particularly linking it to the Langkawi Great Sale. Perhaps we can design these packages.
Hezri, I want to ask you, if Langkawi is far too dependent on tourism, and has this crisis raised questions about the long-term sustainability of the island's economy? Is there talk about needing to pivot the economy to something much more sustainable, less vulnerable to things like global forces, pandemics and such?
Well, we are, I think, about 70% of our economy is dependent on tourism receipt. And, initially from an agricultural and fishery economy, we have, sort of graduated into a service economy mainly on tourism receipt. And I think in the past 3 decades, if you look at the history of Langkawi, it has been quite resilient to global shocks like SARS, global pandemic, SARS and H1N1. But of course, COVID-19 is something that nobody in our lifetime has ever experienced. So it is something new, and there is now I think a serious need to relook into, relook at our development model, and perhaps this is what we're doing now is to encourage the local populace to look into agriculture, for instance. So we need to diversify our economic base. Tourism is important, but there are other factors that need to be propped up as well.
Hezri, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. We really appreciate your time and you sharing your insights and experiences. All the best to you there in Langkawi. That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for this evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.